This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources. Consistent with its Running Right process, Alpha is an energy company committed to being a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward. We fuel progress around the world. More information at alphanr.com.
Haley Buick GMC, the place for a new Verano or Terrain Denali, on Midlothian Turnpike in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Taking it to the streets and helping our community. Intelligent Illuminations. We make streetlights smart and give you control, providing secure point-to-point wireless solutions for roadway and area lighting, helping you manage, monitor, and control your streetlights. More information at ilooms.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com.
It's amazing what my students with special needs can accomplish. Their pride is priceless. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a very special welcome back to Jeff Schapiro. Appreciate your being on. Known not only here in Richmond with your years with the Richmond Times Dispatch, and I think I can very much call you the Dean of the Capital Correspondence now. I did that once before, and you corrected me because there was someone, but who's now retired. But appreciate your being on to help our viewers around the Commonwealth get a better picture of the session that's now ended officially, reconvene days over, and then talk about matters that pertain to 2016. But start us off with some of your analysis of the 2015 session, the good, the bad, and the ugly, or however you would express it.
Well, of course, every year in Virginia is an election year. This particular year is a legislative election year, House and Senate. The House, lopsidedly Republican. Republicans have a 2-to-1 majority. Attribute that to very creative redistricting. The Senate is very closely divided. The Republicans have a 1-seat majority. The governor, a Democrat, is talking loudly and frequently about taking back, as he puts it, my Senate this fall. With this election in mind, legislators, those standing for re-election, tried to be on their best behavior this year. There were lots of, shall we say, brochure bills that don't necessarily go anywhere. Even their sponsors recognize that they may not have much, if any, traction, but a legislator can then put them in his or her brochure and note for the record that he or she has taken this particular stand. Of course, the overarching issue, not one that the legislators were particularly interested in addressing, was clean government, ethics. And all of this was a response to the conviction last September of Bob and Maureen McDonald, federal government successfully arguing that they had sold the governorship. Now, one of the problems, of course, with redistricting is, and one hears this from supporters and opponents, one of the problems rather with ethics reform, and one hears this from supporters and opponents, is that ultimately one cannot legislate good behavior. And I think that was pretty clear with the product that emerged. But in the end, Governor McAuliffe, I think, gets a gold star, or at least his Democratic friends would say he deserves a gold star for prevailing on this hard $100 aggregate cap. In other words, no more than $100 in goodies to a legislator in the course of the year. But this legislative initiative, if one cares to call it that, these folks went kicking and screaming on this measure, has a lot about it that is very familiar to those of us, and legislators too, who remember the old ways under the Bob, if you will, the Bob McDonnell era ethics bill. There's still a lot of self-policing in this. Ultimately, legislators, elective officials, statewide, local, appointive officials as well, ultimately they will decide what they want to disclose. There is some type of advisory commission to handle inquiries about matters. For example, if a legislator is invited on a trip that may have something to do with his or her actual work in the legislature, then this commission, this panel, this committee could make that decision or make some recommendation to that legislator. But there is nothing in that commission's charge that allows it to investigate allegations of misdeeds by legislators, to really independently police members of state and local government. So while there's been a lot of chatter, a lot of headlines, I don't know that there's been a lot of substantive movement in the area of ethics.
Yeah, in the efforts that the governor made with the legislature to have them consider 40-some amendments, there was one that pertained to events that were widely attended by the public. Any comment that you would make on how that one turned out?
Well, keep in mind that, and forgive my cynicism on this, I think it's safe to say that particularly the legislators enjoy their stuff. They sort of welcome the attention they get from lobbyists and associations and local organizations. Now, I say that recognizing that this sort of engagement is part of the process of government. And I think legislators are correct when they say, you know, there are expenses that perhaps they shouldn't have to absorb. However, I'm wondering if it would have been a lot easier just to do away with gifts altogether, maybe not to rule out forms of entertainment, just simply require that it be disclosed. And maybe as well, and this was certainly not an aspect of this debate that was addressed this year, some serious consideration is given to a pay raise for legislators. It's been 20 plus years, actually more than that. Well, 20 plus years.
Yeah, the end of the Blouses administration.
There was the pay was doubled from about $9,000 a year to $18,000 a year. But legislators also receive a $15,000 a year expense allowance that is paid to them as income. And virtually every member of the General Assembly takes that as income. Of course, the public, I don't think, understands this. And so the legislators can say, well, look what you're getting for about $18,000 a year. And in fact, they're being paid about $33,000 a year. Why not take that compensation out of the shadows? The inflation factor is such that if they were being paid what they deserve, at least adjusting for the gyrations of the economy, they'd be making about $34,000 a year. Why not just go ahead and do that? Also, if there's going to continue to be some expense allowance, and one assumes there would be, that it's used strictly for office expenses, travel, administrative costs, and it's something for which the legislators would have to account, publicly account. Certainly the computer software exists to do that.
Well, some say that this ethics, the road to some ethics reform is a process, and this was not the final product. So I guess we'll see whether there's efforts even in 2016 to make any changes.
There are many legislators who are anticipating some revisions when the legislature returns in January 16. Also in January 16, this new law takes effect.
Yes.
So there may be some, shall we say, reflection ahead of the January 2016 session that might lead to some tweaks. And the governor, too, has an opportunity to talk a bit about this during this election cycle. There were a number of people who would note that win or lose on reconvene day, the governor was going to come out a winner. If the legislature bowed to his wishes, and it did by kind of going into overtime, it was actually Friday following that spring veto session that all of this was buttoned up. But had he not prevailed, he certainly would have had a theme for this important political cycle. He needs to see a Democratic majority in the Senate because that's going to provide him with some traction, legislative traction, for the backside of his term.
Yeah, as you look into the Schapiro crystal ball, looking ahead to 2016, do you see any reason for either party to have strong reasons to be hoping for a majority in the Senate, for the Republicans to maintain it or pick up another seat or two, or for the Democrats, as you have looked around the state?
Well, these districts, using the districts held by Democrats as an example, these are districts in which their Democratic proclivity is greatest during presidential cycles. It is perhaps considerably less pronounced in a legislative cycle. The turnouts are going to be very, very low. Maybe in the aggregate statewide, 25%, maybe. That is a problem for the Democrats this year. What the Democrats will do, as the Republicans will do, will make a strong pitch to the party base to get it out. But that low turnout, the selective competition, and the likelihood that in some of these districts, the bigger, more interesting races might be for local offices. For example, sheriff. Talk about someone who lives and works among the people he or she serves. So that could complicate things too. The Republicans believe they can hold their majority. The Republicans believe they have a chance to pick up a seat that had been held for many years by a Democrat, a Northern Virginia seat of Chuck Colgan. Democrats, on the other hand, believe they can pick up a Republican-held seat in the Richmond suburbs, John Watkins. So there are many complicating factors.
And if I could chime in and add to one other complicating factor, in some of those districts, even the ones you mentioned, the big battle is in the June 9th primary, who's going to be this party's candidate or that party's candidate, because there are places where there are 3 or 4 seeking the nomination to run for the Senate.
In suburban Richmond, Walter Stosh, one of the co-chairs of the Finance Committee, along with Chuck Colgan, retiring after 3 decades in the legislature. There's a four-way race for the Republican nomination. There is not a Democratic candidate at this point. There doesn't seem to be any indication that there will be a Democratic candidate. So to your point, the primary, the Republican primary, will be, or could very well be, tantamount to election. It's a throwback to the old days, the conservative Democratic era, when the Democratic primary pretty much settled everything.
And in the districts where Senator Watkins and Senator Colgan, Republicans have centered in on a candidate. Democrats, I believe, have three in each of those Senate districts vying for that nomination. So the outcome of those nominations certainly could have some effect on the strength or weakness of that party in November.
And again, these districts were drawn to produce certain results. And the Democrats, as well as the Republicans, recognize this and will really be emphasizing the themes that promote the most strongly blue response or the most strongly red response. In some of these more, or if you will, nominally competitive or potentially competitive districts, one should look to the candidates to sort of blur the distinctions. Certainly, I think that'll be the case in the Colgan district. Hal Parrish, former mayor of Manassas Park, I believe, Manassas City, is the presumed Republican nominee, well known in a fast-changing and growing and increasingly diverse Democratic district, though the city of which he was mayor is only about 20% of that district. So Democrats would say he might have his work cut out for him.
Going back to not really the ethics issue, but to another issue that somewhat emerged after the session in a news conference, transparency. Now that may relate to ethics and relate to an election year that so many bills did not really have a vote. You've been a keen observer and commenter on matters here at the Capitol since the early 1980s. Do you perceive more or less transparency, or is it about the same as it was, let's say, in the 80s?
Well, I think one of the things that contributes to the lack of transparency, or the growing lack of transparency, is the growing workload of the General Assembly. Thousands of bills introduced. I think it was on the order of 3,000 bills and resolutions this year, close to it. But there are, particularly in the House of Delegates, an elaborate system of subcommittees to vet all of this stuff. It's created a lot of little kings, if you will, and some queens within the legislature. And I think that's just, there are the physical demands of trying to keep up with that increasingly narrowly sliced system. Now, I don't offer that as a defense of the legislature's conduct. I only offer it as again, a complicating factor. There are lots of bills and lots of ideas on which legislators, Democrat and Republican, are happy to vote. There are many on which they are perfectly content not to vote. They don't want to get it in the record that they voted yes or no for a particular bill. There are some fairly sensitive issues that have powerful resonance within the parties. Gun control, abortion rights, some of this stuff, sometimes the recorded vote is best avoided.
You know, an issue that was pretty hot at the prior to the session in the early part, and then it disappeared, was an effort to call for some sort of a constitutional convention of the states, or by, was that one, do you think, too, that folks were almost just glad not to vote on as it went forward? Or
Oh, clearly. This was a bill, particularly an idea, that had a good deal of wind behind it, political and rhetorical, coming out of the House side. Even the Speaker of the House, Bill Howell, was in favor of it, as was his presumed successor, Kirk Cox. It was largely seen for what I suspect everyone knows it is, a bow to libertarians and Tea Partiers who see the government as out of control, and some type of a constitutional convention as a way to rein it in. There are a lot of constitutionalists, conservative, moderate, and liberal, who think a constitutional convention is the worst possible idea, that it's nothing more than an excuse for the wrong people to take control of the process. And I think as this went along, it became increasingly clear that using the House Republican caucus as an example, this was not an issue on which there needed to be a vote, a big vote. And so it had a way of magically dying.
It did. Very quietly went away.
Well, I don't know how quietly it died, because I think the press made a point that it was being, how shall I put this, garroted and then drowned in a tub.
That's a good way of expressing it. Other issues that went by the wayside, they maybe had a vote and failed. Do you see, again, as you look toward 2016, some issues emerging? And let me mention one that I don't know if it's on your list you think would emerge, and that is the issue of expanding health care access in the Commonwealth. Is that gone, or is that back in 16? Or
this is the Medicaid-financed expansion of Obamacare. This was the issue on which Terry McAuliffe, as a Frosh governor, staked his first year. The issue in which he dragged the legislature into overtime. Certainly now, publicly, he talks about other issues and moving on, and using his executive power as governor to take what steps he can. There are continuing murmurs that perhaps in 2016, or maybe after the 2016 election, that there might be some move. That it would seem that there are very few opportunities politically to pull that off, with the presidential election ahead in 2016, and of course in 2017, a statewide election, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and the House again up for re-election. One issue we haven't discussed is this continuing hangover on redistricting. And how can that possibly scramble things? I think a lot of people would agree that when the Democrats challenged in first the majority black congressional district of Bobby Scott as racial gerrymandering, and then about a dozen or so African American House of Delegates districts, most people believe this was a very thin reed on which the Democrats should rest their hopes for a more balanced approach to legislative redistricting. But the Democrats have prevailed on the congressional redistricting question. It's now back before the court, and the court will be expecting, the trial court that is, the court will be expecting the legislature to submit some sort of a plan by September 1st. That means the legislature has to come up with something that satisfies Governor McAuliffe, who has said he would like to see at least 2 more competitive congressional districts. The issues that were raised, litigated, vetted all the way up to the Supreme Court, to the Democrats' advantage, are almost identical in the legislative redistricting litigation. So what if the Democrats get the leg up on that? We could see in 2017 perhaps a different landscape.
That is a tremendously big issue that you have mentioned right here at the close of our program, and we're going to have you back on because there's that short window that something will have to be done. And Jeff Schapiro, Richmond Times Dispatch, follow you on Twitter in your columns, and thank you so much for being on This Week in Richmond, and we do look forward to having you back.
Thank you, David. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources, a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward.
Haley Buick GMC in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Intelligent Illuminations, helping you manage, monitor, and control your streetlights. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.